So really excited. And thank Bernard for coming live for us today. On Wednesday, we did have that announcement but read the OCR. So he felt strongly enough that that was relevant to what we all do in our daily lives. So I'll let Bernard take over. Just
fantastic. Hopefully you can all see me there on screen. I wanted to show my face before I showed my presentation as well. It's lovely to see you all. And
we've lost the screen share.
Yep, that's right. I went back off the screen share to me. That was part of the plan. And I'm really pleased to see you all. I hope you can see and hear me. I'm in my home office in Auckland with a big old microphone, which I use for my podcasting, and hopefully we'll get this going smoothly. Really appreciate the chance to have a chat with you, because I've got plenty of news on the economics front, on the Reserve Bank, interest rates, house prices, politics, the budget. It's been a busy couple of weeks, so I wanted to give you an update on that, what it might mean for interest rates and house prices, and what we can expect over the next 4 or 5 months, particularly with a big day, October the 14th, Election Day, and what that might mean for all of the things that we know and care about. I used to have a saying when I was the co-founder of interest.co.nz, which you might have heard of or regularly use. We had a saying in the office, and we had a big sign on the wall that said, there's only 2 things that really matter in New Zealand. They are interest rates and house prices. And, you know, there's actually a bit of a connection between the two as well. So really, interest rates in many ways drive a lot of what's going on in the housing market. And interest rates are a product of what's happening in the rest of the world, and also what's happening here, and particularly what's happening with economic growth and inflation. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, what's happening with the budget. So I'll give you an update on that. Now, what I'm going to do now is share my presentation here, and hopefully you can all see that and run through it over the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. I'll make sure there's plenty of time for questions, which is the fun part for me and maybe for you as well. So key things to remember out of the presentation today, I think, are we are in the midst of another population shock. We've seen population growth over the last 20 years or so, average around about 30,000 net migration per year. And that has meant we've had population growth of about 1.5% to 2%. Now, obviously during COVID, as you can see there with the red line, net migration went negative. And we lost a few people, but it has bounced back much faster and more aggressively than we thought it would, and than the Reserve Bank and Treasury thought. And what you can see there is a chart from the Reserve Bank's monetary policy statement on Wednesday, which shows how the migration story has changed relative to what the Reserve Bank was expecting. And so the blue line is the Reserve Bank expectations from its last monetary policy statement, and what we've ended up with now. And what you can see there is that we've bounced from negative to around about 25 to 30,000 per quarter. In fact, in the last 3 months, it was more like 36,000. And if we kept going at this rate for the full year, we'd have well over 100,000 net migrants in this year. That would be population growth of over 2%. And that is very, very fast in our history, and faster than almost all other developed economies. Ironically, the one other developed economy with such strong population growth at the moment is Australia. And they are going through their own population and particularly migration boom, fueled by a bunch of Kiwis, by the way, who are going over there to now look to become full citizens. So that's been the big shock in the last 3 or 4 months, and that's had quite a few implications. And up until Wednesday, we weren't quite sure how the Reserve Bank saw it, because you can look at migration as a good shock or a bad shock, or In fact, both a bad shock and a good shock. So let me explain what I mean. Obviously, as more people come into the country, they need somewhere to live. They are buying things. They are creating households. They are going to Bunnings Warehouse and buying what they need to start a house. They're buying a car. They're starting to spend money. And that tends to provide a bit of a boost for demand in the economy and can push up prices and rents. However, at the same time, with all those extra people coming into the country, and we know that most of them work, that actually provides extra supply of labour into the economy and can take some of the pressure off wages. And in the long run, in the past, it has done that. So the Reserve Bank looked at those two sides of the equation, the demand boost to boost inflation and the supply boost to drag down on inflation. And they've decided it's about net, even though it's been quite a shock. Key thing to know there, of course, is that the Reserve Bank is seeing it come back down again quite quickly. They see this as a temporary shock. Now, that's debatable. I actually think we might see that migration stay higher for longer than what the Reserve Bank and Treasury says. And that's important in our inflation outlook, because I think high net migration actually is going to drag down on wage inflation and inflation generally, even though it's counterintuitive because there are more people in the country buying more things. Because one of the great things about migration from a government point of view is that the people who are coming here, come here, they start earning money, they start paying PAYE tax, they start buying things and they pay GST. And so the government's books very quickly get into surplus when you have lots of migration. That's one of the reasons politicians love it. And when you have the government's books in surplus, that means they don't have to borrow so much. So there's not so much upward pressure on interest rates. And so migration, I think, generally is a low inflation, low interest rate story. That's good news, of course, if you benefit from low and falling interest rates. And the second big message to come out of today's presentation is we're having a migration shock. That's probably good for dragging down on mortgage rates. Inflation is peaking, and we will probably see mortgage rates falling by the end of this year. All around the world, central banks are pausing on their interest rate hikes, and people in financial markets see central banks cutting interest rates towards the end of this year. And so that's a good mortgage rate story. The other sort of positive thing I want to put out there is that the population growth obviously provides more demand for housing and particularly for rentals, given many people here do not have the right to buy a home, even if they could afford it. There may be some who can afford it but can't buy easily until they're a resident. So that means more demand for rent, and at least initially, not quite so much competition to buy houses. And so migration is a good news story for people who own and rent out properties. It's also a good news story for mortgage rates and for inflation, in my view, although there are others who have different views. But certainly on Wednesday, the Reserve Bank took a quite nuanced view on this and decided that the migration shock wasn't an extra inflationary pressure, and certainly not enough for them to change the way they viewed what was happening with interest rates and inflation. And the other potentially sunny thing on the horizon is the potential of a change of government. Now, the polls are very close. And in fact, since I did the initial version of this presentation on Wednesday, we've seen some more poll results showing it's still very close. The most recent poll, just one of the polls, shows that National and ACT would be able to govern alone, albeit with a very tight margin, just one spare seat in the House. And of course, we know that National have promised to repeal interest deductibility for rental property investors, and have also promised to bring back or to cut back the Bright Line test, which is now for quite a long period. I also suspect that National will stop new house building by Kāinga Ora, at least at the scale it was. and potentially freeze new infrastructure investment while it takes a look at what it can afford. And that is going to restrict some of the new housing supply coming onto the market, and will give people who have the houses out to rent a little bit more power in that balance between demand and supply. So there is some good news on the horizon, and there are some good things happening today. And that, I hope, is some of the message that you take from this presentation. We may be going into the depths of winter, and it may feel like things are very tough at the moment. And certainly it has been very tough for the last 2 or 3 years for many people running small businesses, working flat out, not enough staff, all the dramas with COVID, all the dramas with the storms. But on the horizon, it's quite possible we could see mortgage rates falling towards the end of the year, a change of government, a significant bounce back in house prices, and a falling mortgage rates at the same time as very low unemployment and plenty of demand and the ability to pay for higher rents. So that's the basic outline of what I'm saying here today. And if you were to run out to go to the loo right now and you didn't somehow get back in again, the key things to know are: A, population is growing very strongly. That's good news. B, mortgage rates have peaked and are likely to fall towards the end of this year. And that may not be the story that you're hearing a lot. And C, the potential for a change of government is real, which would be positive for property prices, and also to potentially drag down on interest rates as the government runs smaller deficits and earlier surpluses and borrows less. So that's the guts of the story. Let's start to pick it apart and look in particular first at what we saw in last week's budget, where Grant Robertson was in a pretty chirpy mood, actually. And I did wonder, sometimes when you're about to finish your last exam and go home for the summer, you're feeling pretty good about life. And I do wonder if this is his last budget, or this was his last budget. It's a sixth budget. And obviously he wants Labor to get re-elected, but he's not standing again in Wellington Central. He's going to be a list MP. And if Labor lose, I definitely think he will retire pretty quickly. I even think there's a chance that if Labor wins, sure, he's the finance minister for the beginning of the next term, but it would surprise me if he's still around at the end of a third term. So Grant Robertson presenting the budget there. That's his fifth wellbeing budget. In my personal view, wellbeing is a phrase that has been bandied about by this government, and actually it was sort of hinted at by the previous government. They used to use a thing called the Living Standards Framework, and a lot of the work that's been done inside Treasury and the likes, it was actually started when Bill English was the finance minister. But I don't think that either Treasury or the government have managed the government's finances to maximise wellbeing, or even measure some of these wellbeing measures, things like future liabilities for climate emissions, the health effects on workers, and the stress of all sorts of things. And either it's going to be his last budget or his fourth to last. So we'll know after October 14, hopefully quite quickly. And the keys to that are how median voters will do it. Okay. The other highlights from the budget, I think. Kāinga Ora have been given the funding for one more year of house building, about 3,000 houses a year. And that's going to add some supply to the market for social housing, but that's where it stops. So even Labor wasn't able to or willing to commit to another couple of years of funding for Kāinga Ora. So I think there's a real risk or an opportunity, depending on who you are, that Kāinga Ora are essentially frozen, or not quite shut down from their big house building program, but certainly there'll be a review if there's a change of government. The government also promised in the budget to extend the Apprenticeship Boost program. Now, you may not have heard of this. It's a COVID era thing that actually Chris Hipkins did when he was Education Minister. And the idea was to pay employers some extra money so they would take on apprentices, to pay all of the fees for apprentices. So there was no barriers for people, young people in particular, to go and learn a trade. And that's been really effective. And so that's extended for another year. But if National gets in, it's quite costly, and it's one of the things that might go. And certainly the pressure will be on National to explain what they do. Labor has also said if you've got 2-year-olds, you can get some early childhood education subsidies. That's extended. That's positive for a particular type of voter, particularly young families in the suburbs who have to work to pay a big mortgage. Being able to get the kids off to early childhood education early is going to help them get back to work earlier. The $5 prescription fee was obviously scrapped. That's also great news for a lot of young families and also older voters who really don't like that $5 fee. And I personally think it's also great news for the overall health system, because we know that about 130,000 prescriptions are not picked up every year because people can't afford that fee. There's also, if you're a games developer in your spare time, there's going to be a rebate there. It's a bit like the movie studio rebates. And Treasury said that they didn't think we were going to have a recession this year. So that's good news. They're just dialing back a bit at some of the things that were given out in the budget. I describe them as, in many ways, middle-class welfare. And they're exactly the sort of little thing that is useful to a particular type of voters. I call them the netball mum voter. So this is someone who is in their 30s and 40s. They might have a kid or two. That kid either is in, between the ages of 5 and 15. They've got plenty of stress and financial pressures in their lives. They think mostly, and they care mostly about getting into their own home and building a family. And they are the median voters that you're going to see political parties from both sides go for. The other sort of news out of the budget, the surplus is going to be 1 year later. The extra spending that the government's doing, largely around repairing after the earthquakes and those bits and pieces of giveaways there, that is a little bit expansionary this year. But as you can see in this chart here, the deficit is turned into a surplus by 2027, and that black line there, that is the net debt as a percentage of GDP line. It peaks at about 23-24% of GDP and then comes off a bit. So what's actually happened here? You might have heard in the news, the opposition saying that the government is spending like a drunken sailor, it's addicted to spending, and that's the reason why mortgage rates have gone up. Well, and they argue that this budget 2023 was also expansionary. Now, you've got to remember that there was also some offsetting income measures there to try and reduce the net effect on the budget deficit, and that was the increase in the trust rate from 33% to 39% from April next year. And it's interesting that National haven't necessarily said, well, we're going to repeal that, obviously, because up until last year, they were going to get rid of the 39% tax rate. Well, they've backed off that because it's now quite expensive to get rid of, particularly once you add in the trust area. And we know that there's a certain small percentage of trusts that have a lot of income going through them. Nearly 80% of the income goes through 5% of the trusts. And Labor is promoting that tax increase for trusts as a way to tax some of the income that some of the wealthiest New Zealanders put their income through. Because we discovered, and by the way, it's going to raise quite a bit of money, particularly up front, about 1.1 billion in those first few years. We found from an IRD study that actually we have a few families who are quite wealthy in New Zealand, and a lot of their money goes through trusts and is taxed at that 33% rate. Now, a lot of it also is currently in land values, and often that land isn't sold, there isn't a capital gain recorded, and so that wealth is essentially not taxed. We also don't have an inheritance tax. So the IRD worked out that these 311 families made $14.6 billion in income in 2021-22, if you count the rise in the values of their assets as income. And if you count that, then they effectively paid their effective tax rate was 9.5%. Whereas if you're on PAYE, if you don't own a property or any land or any assets, your effective tax rate's 30%. So I think the government is going to nudge into this area of how to tax wealth. I don't think they'll have another crack at capital gains tax, but certainly we can expect more of a debate on what happens to the tax, what happens to the very, very high incomes and whether enough tax is being paid. So maybe we'll talk about that in the questions. Often that's a popular topic. Now, just to reinforce here that over the 4 years of the budget track, let's just go back to that one. You can see that chart on the left. What that shows you is what's called the fiscal impulse. So for fiscal policy tragics like me, this is a fun chart, which essentially says that every time one of the bars is below the line, you're sucking energy out of the economy. You're sucking inflationary pressures out of the economy. Now, in 2023-24, there is a bit of a boost, about 1.7%. And that was the thing the opposition jumped on and said, that's the inflationary thing. Well, the Reserve Bank is saying, well, look, over the 4 years, it's actually detracting from growth over the final 3 years of that 4 years. And actually net, there's a contraction from the government over the 4 years. So interestingly, Adrian Orr said at the Monetary Policy Statement press conference that the government was actually more of a friend for monetary policy than an enemy. So that sort of put the kibosh on this idea that the government was the main driver for inflation, was going to drive up mortgage rates. And it's interesting that we haven't seen too many fixed rate increases, certainly since the official cash rate change. And that's because I think those longer term fixed rates are at the beginning of plateauing out. And in some cases, as you've already seen for some of the longer term rates, they are falling. Let's talk about politics. If we're going to go there, I think we'll have to go there because it's coming up quite quickly. Here is a chart showing all of the polls since the last election in 2020. So the little blue dots and red dots, they are the relative positions of the parties in all of the polls. And the red lines and the blue lines and the other lines are essentially the smoothed average, if you like. It's a weighted average, but a smoothed average of all of the polls going together. And from my point of view, this is often the best way to look at all of the noise you see in polls. And you can see some pretty clear patterns there. As you can tell, the first year and a half of this term, Labor was well ahead. They got the benefit of the doubt on COVID until they didn't. And in late 2021, it all turned. And by February, March of 2022, the newly led Christopher Luxon-led Labor National Party was ahead, and they've been ahead. They were ahead for all of 2022. I think it was one of the reasons that Jacinda Ardern decided to go in January. And for those of you who were at a previous presentation I gave to the Federation, you'll know that I suggested there was a good chance the Prime Minister would retire early, and she did. And it has transformed the chances of Labor in the election from being probably likely to lose to now being it's quite possible that they could win a third term. As you can see there, National have been coming off the boil for most of the last 15 months or so and have fallen on the trend rate under Labor. Now, there's one poll that came out last week, last Friday, I think, that showed National a bit ahead. And according to the current polls, let's just go back there. Current polls, well, the very last poll we saw, the One News Kantar poll, National and ACT could govern alone without needing New Zealand First or Te Pāti Māori or anyone. Now, Christopher Luxon has ruled out working with Te Pāti Māori, so it really has to be a clean win, so to speak. They have to be able to govern a loan. That's a big bet because it's quite hard to do that. We've only had one election really, and that was the last one, which was a bit different, where we didn't have a coalition. That it wasn't that close that the main parties had to do a deal, one of the smaller ones. And so what we have now is a bit of a horse race. It's going to come down to what 50 to 100,000 voters do in the next 4 months or so. And remember, because of early voting, and we had so much early voting last time, that has meant that we're going to see really the campaign starts in about 3 or 4 weeks, because so many people vote early. You really need to get your message out there and convince people to flip early. Now, I just wanted to go back into the economy and just give a sense of the sweep of what's happening at the moment, how the year started and how it's going so far. And we thought there was going to be a summer. I'm talking here, obviously, for a lot of people in the North Island. I think it was more pleasant in the South Island, but we thought it was going to be in summer. There wasn't. It rained for most of January, February, and into March. We obviously had those 2 awful floods, which were incredibly financially damaging. They were the second worst natural disaster in New Zealand's history, not just from an insurance point of view, but from a general cost point of view. And it's the second worst after the Christchurch earthquakes, and worse than the Kaikoura earthquakes, and way worse than any of the other floods. So it's a big deal, and it's going to increase insurance prices. And I don't know if you saw, but this week, I think it was on Thursday, Tower, which led the market a few years ago in moving to risk-based pricing for earthquakes, has now just moved to risk-based pricing for flood and slips and sea level change. What that means is Tower is just going through its books, looking at anything that could get flooded and whacking up their insurance premiums. So this is where the rubber hits the road really on climate change, and you certainly have to think about potential flood risk whenever you're buying properties or holding properties, because there is going to be a reworking of the insurance market to account for that. Now, just to step back and say, well, boy, it's been a really, really bad year. Well, I just push back on that and say, hey, we've got very low unemployment. Most households still have plenty of equity. Not that many are in really difficult positions. And we are all much healthier than we feel. So when you look at what's happening with default rates, so how many people are behind on their loans that are effectively non-performing loans, it's an incredibly low percentage. Yes, it's up from a record low, but it's still less than a third of what we had through 2008, 9, 10. So there is an awful lot of strong balance sheets out there after 10, 15 years of rising house prices. And when you've had unemployment at 3, 4% for, going on 7 or 8 years now, that is very good for household balance sheet strength. However, when you ask people how they feel in consumer confidence and in business confidence surveys, they say, "Oh, I'm not keen to invest and spend. I'm feeling really down on things. Things are really bad at the moment. I've just spent 15 minutes looking at Twitter, and it's all bad on there." Well, actually, when you look at what people are doing with their money, they are still spending it. They are still investing it. Now, one of the things we have with our economy is that when there's a slowdown in the number of houses being bought and sold, certainly that restricts some of the ability for people to free up equity when they sell a house, and also just slows down the whole process of household formation, which is often a trigger for spending on couches and curtains and renting a truck to move your stuff. So that is holding things back a bit, but certainly people have plenty of income. Now, just looking at the inflation front, you may be wondering, boy, inflation's been painful and we don't know it's going to drop. Well, actually, we do. We know that most of our inflation has come from the rest of the world, and we haven't been that different from the rest of the world in experiencing the sort of inflation we have. Here is a measure of what's going on in the global supply chain. This is an index put together by the US Federal Reserve, and it shows you what's happened in the last year or so. After the COVID dramas, obviously you can see that spike up at the end to, record most stress levels ever, but it's collapsed now to the point where supply chains are less stressed than they've been for going on 15 years. So this is good news for, shipping rates and container availabilities. And I don't know if you've seen the stories in the last week or so, but we are certainly seeing surpluses of containers, and the people who build containers are in the process of winding down their production. So what we're actually seeing is some deflationary pressures starting to come through, particularly in China. Europe's not quite there yet, but you've got to remember in Europe that they have just gone through a winter which was much warmer than expected. Right, just wanted to talk about this guy. Now, he's probably not the most popular man in the country at the moment, after he just put up interest rates the fastest and the most in most people's lifetimes. Sadly, I'm quite old, so I can remember some other times, but for most people who've been buying houses in the last 10, 15 years, this is all very unusual. And so what you're seeing here is the Reserve Bank Governor, Adrian Orr. He's just put up the official cash rate by 0.25%. He was quite dovish in his forecasts and the bank's outlook. He essentially said, that's it. We've beaten inflation. I've done enough. You could basically see him, wiping his hands and saying, right, I'm off to the pub for a beer. We're on top of this inflation thing. That surprised a few people who'd expected the official cash rate would still have to go up to 5.75 or even 6%. But essentially, Adrian Orr said over the weekend, no, that's it. We're at the peak. He's also, just in the last month or so, announced and just confirmed on Friday the easing of the LVRs. So that means that people who are buying a house they're going to live in can borrow more than 80%. Now, they could always do that, but there wasn't much room for the banks to do it. They only could do 10% maximum of their lending flow. Well, that's just increased to 15%. And the threshold and the definition for high LVR lending for rental property investors has gone up from 60% to 65%. So that's good news too. This really is the key chart if you want to understand what's going on in the economy right now, both the good pressures and the bad pressures. Look at that. That is the arrivals, departures, net migration. And you can see that actual arrivals are at record highs of long-term arrivals, so not quite there yet for tourists. And so our net migration could be even higher if it wasn't for the New Zealanders leaving to go and live and work in Australia. And there's about 30,000 of those who've done that in the last year or so. And that, for those people who employ people, it's one of the great, I suppose, mysteries or factors to watch, is that there are plenty of jobs around, but often the New Zealanders aren't there to take them because they've already gone. So we have to get people in from outside. So we've got a bit of a churn problem. That's just the way it is here at the moment. Right, I'm just going to go back actually here to this chart, because it shows you how housing affordability in terms of house prices to income have basically come back to where they were pre-COVID. So on the left-hand side, you've got median house price to median household disposable income measures, and those are for the main areas. The red's for New Zealand. The blue is Auckland. Wellington is the purple, and Canterbury is the green. I probably would have come up with different colours for that. But anyway, certainly for all of those, they've come off their peaks in terms of affordability. Now, that, of course, doesn't take into account the effects of interest rates, mortgage rates, which have made things unaffordable for those who need to borrow a lot of money. But when you look at house prices adjusted for wages, basically we're back down to pre-COVID levels. So the moment mortgage rates start falling, there is going to be plenty of demand from first-time buyers as they realize that they can buy a house if they've got a decent income. And sure, the deposit's going to be quite tough, but remember the Reserve Bank's just made it slightly easier for the banks to lend to some people for at more than 80%. And it's interesting, the banks are really starting to get their competitive mojo going with cashbacks and all sorts of deals. And I think that's one of the factors to watch and think about over the next year or so, is that not only the underlying drivers for inflation and interest rates are pushing downwards, but also the banks themselves are, of course, keen to do more lending, and mortgage lending is what they do these days. They don't necessarily do much business lending. In fact, since COVID there's been no net new business lending. It's all been in housing. So that is something to suggest that towards the end of this year, there's going to be a downdraft on mortgage rates as inflation comes off the boil and the banks look to get going. And you can see how that's reflected in the Reserve Bank's forecasts of house prices. There we have it, the chart showing that basically since February, the Reserve Bank has increased its forecast for house prices by 7.8%. So we're not going to dive quite as far as we thought we were, and we're going to bounce back a bit sooner. And essentially, we headed on the way back up towards the end of this year. Here's a wild prediction for you. Last time I spoke to a federation, I predicted there was a chance that the Prime Minister would retire, and I won that chocolate fish bet. Well, I think there is a credible series of potential series of events which mean that A, mortgage rates are falling by the end of this year, particularly the longer term fixed mortgage rates. That B, the new supply of housing coming onto the market dries up, in part because of a drying up of new state housing supply. And the key thing to watch here, of course, is what happens with the election. In my view, if there is a clear win for National and ACT on October the 14th, and it's clear that during the election campaign, they've reiterated their plans to repeal interest deductibility and to shift Brightline back, and also to squeeze down on infrastructure investment and new housing supply. I think there's a genuine chance that in that weekend after the election, the open homes weekend after the election, and in the auctions in the week after the election, you see an immediate 10 to 15% jump in house prices. And that's why the election result, I think, is going to be so important, because not only do you see with a National ACT government, though, the reversion back to the previous situation for the tax situation for rental property investors, you also see downward pressure on mortgage rates because you're likely to see tighter fiscal policy from a National ACT government. You're also going to see a loosening of migration settings, so even more people coming in to demand new housing. And obviously the restrictions on kāinga ora building and an initial freeze on planning for investment that councils need to, get new housing supply into the market will mean that it'll be a good time if you're setting rents, and it'll also be a good time when you're refixing your mortgage rates. That's if there's a change of government. If there is a change of government, I'm betting on the 10 to 20% in the following weekends after the election. Right. And the core of my argument and the core of, the outlook is it's all about, so what is inflation going to do? This was the big shock in the last couple of years. I mean, interest rates went up. It really surprised everyone, including the central banks. And if you think that inflation is not coming down, or even that it's going to go even higher, then understandably, you're going to throw some eggs at me apart from anything else. And that's fair enough. And if we do see inflation take off again for whatever reason, I'll put my hands up and say, you know, I got that one wrong. Well, have a look there. There's the chart for headline inflation for our key trading partners and what's happening to inflation. Look at those charts and tell me that you think inflation is now out of control and headed towards double-digit levels in the developed countries. No. Euro inflation back down towards 6%, US under 6%. Australia has paused basically for interest rates. And look at China. Actually, Chinese inflation is very, very low. And in various parts in the last few months, we've seen deflation in China. And I just wanted to throw this chart in here. I always like one signature wow chart. And this is my idea of a fun time. This is a chart for US egg prices for the last 3 years or so. And they had some similar issues to us, not the free range issue. They had a bird flu issue, but also higher egg food price, chicken food prices. The egg comes after the chicken and the chicken comes after the food. And what you can see there is that egg prices rose to $5.20 US dollars, $5.20 a dozen towards the end of 2022. And it's collapsed from $5 a dozen to under $1 a dozen. So if you're ever in the US and you think, what am I going to bring home because I can't get it in New Zealand? Just put, 6 dozen eggs in the overhead locker and see how that goes. But they'll be cheap eggs if they make it back. And the other thing to watch is that European gas prices have collapsed in the last 3 or 4 months. There are some positives of climate change, and one of them is that it didn't get cold in Germany and Northern Europe over the winter, so there was not a lot of gas used, and so demand for gas fell. And even though some people think, well, we've had some very fast increases in interest rates, therefore aren't we going to have a global recession? Well, actually, the signs in the last 3 or 4 months have been quite positive, quite resilient. Economic growth in the United States, employment, and also the US house building market has done quite well. And China obviously was having some tough times during COVID, but has bounced out of there quite nicely. So let's now, I'm going to actually just leave it there because I think I've got the basic message across. That is, we'll all be watching the election result. Inflation is coming off the boil. Interest rates have peaked, probably be falling by the end of this year. And if we see a change of government, keep an eye on those auctions and open homes. It could be an interesting time, but that the election result is no sure thing either way and will depend on about 50 to 100,000 median voters and what they do. I wanted to open it up now because I know we're close to time, and I really look forward to the questions. So what I'm going to do is end the share, if you like, stop share so you can see my face, and hopefully I can see yours as well. So yeah, there we go. You're on mute there, I think.
Under instructions here, Ben.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah. I'm going to call for questions. Now, you may have to either relay through me or whiz up here and talk to Bernard here. Tim Horsburgh.
We do see quite a rapid increase in house prices at the end of the year as a change of government. Is it likely that the Reserve Bank will bring in debt to income ratio quickly?
That's a question. Sorry, Tim.
And what effect will that have on borrowing for the likes of an investor group like us?
To relay the question, the debt to income ratios that the Reserve Bank has that tool to do, we're all scared. Should we be?
Yeah. So the Reserve Bank has sort of penciled that in for next year. I think they're keeping it in its back pocket if there is some sort of firing up of the housing market again. let's say, for example, mortgage rates get cut back to 4%, 5% or so, and there is no new houses built and the tax situation changes, they might want to bring something in to tighten things up again. You're right, with the Reserve Bank's proposals there, that would make it more difficult for rental property investors to borrow. And it really depends on what the Reserve Bank is able to do. Now, remember, unlike with monetary policy, with the official cash rate, the Reserve Bank is not truly independent when it comes to prudential controls like loan to value ratios or debt to income multiples. It needs the permission of the government. And that's what everyone sort of forgets about LVRs and DTIs. Now, when the LVRs were first brought in by Graham Wheeler, everyone assumed that the government could do nothing. And behind the scenes, Bill English and John Key were furious with Wheeler. It's one of the reasons he didn't get a second term. And the Reserve Bank came under enormous pressure from the government of the day not to do certain things. For example, the Reserve Bank tried to get debt to income multiples in 2017, and the national government said no. So I don't think, if there is a change of government, I don't think Adrian Orr, and boy, wouldn't you love to be a fly on the wall in the first meeting between Adrian Orr and Nicola Willis as finance minister. So I think, yes, the Reserve Bank has the debt to income multiple controls in its pocket. They could use it. I think there will be a very high bar for it to be used, simply because of the pressure that will come back on the Reserve Bank from the government if there is a change of government.
Bernard, one of the things Chris Bishop told us was they're going to sack Adrian Orr. He was quite implicit about that. So you've got Kristen Sutherland here from Auckland with a question.
Hi, Bernard.
Cool.
So I like your prediction of the weekend after National winning, but what happens if the weekend after Labor wins? What's your prediction for prices then?
Yeah, so you could argue that Labor's policies are already baked into prices. And even with those policies baked in, we are seeing some bottoming out and some green shoots appear here and there. And that's because, balance sheets are so strong. Mortgage rates have stopped rising. Unemployment is very low. And there is certainly not nearly enough houses being built. And of course, with the migration really taking off, that's adding plenty of demand. So it's quite possible that if Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori get in, you wouldn't see too much of a change in house prices immediately after. I don't think you'd see some sort of, oh no, I definitely was sure we were going to have a National Act government and therefore I'm going to pull my bid. Because for most people, you deal with what you've got in front of you, and the incumbents right now are Labour Green. And so I don't think it changes the equation much if Labour Green win a third term. If anything, we're already starting to see a bit of a bounce back going on. And some of the key drivers, apart from tax policy, are high net migration, flat or even falling mortgage rates by the end of this year, and enough house the market to provide any sort of drag on rents and prices just through too much supply. So I think it's more likely to be a flat, no great change scenario if there's a third term, if Labour and Greens are elected for a third term. But on the other side, if National Act get in, because there's obviously uncertainty about that, then boy, that's going to be a busy auction next week. And I think anyone who's thinking of selling in the next, obviously winter's not a great time to sell anything, and most people are not being put under pressure by their banks. Now is not a good time to sort of sell, to be frank. If you wait until, October the 15th or after then, A, that's a pretty normal time to put your house on the market, the spring's open homes season. But B, you have the potential to take advantage of that 10 to 20% jump. You'd feel a bit painful, there'd be pain if you sold your house on October the 13th And then there was a change of government and then prices jumped 10-20%.
Frozen
So,
again.
so I suspect,
No, it was something. What loosened it up before? I think it's our Wi-Fi. Sorry, Bernard, we lost that for a minute. Wi-Fi. Just the end of that.
did we get to the point where I said probably no change if Labor Green get in, but think carefully if you are about to sell your house in the next 3 or 4 months that you might miss out on that 10-20% bounce if there is a change of government.
Yeah, I think definitely. Any further questions from the floor? Yes, Sharon. From
Why he predicted or how he knew about the introduction of it 3 weeks before it was announced publicly?
how did you know about interest deductibility 3 weeks before it was announced publicly? That's Sharon Colwick from Hawke's Bay asking you that.
Oh, did I? I wish I had.
Yeah, he did.
Apparently you were predicting that quite accurately. Yeah.
Ah,
Congratulations.
yeah, no, thank you. Okay, I'll claim credit for it. That's good. I try to stay close to the ground. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, obviously I can't do any insider trading, because, you know, you'd have to have some sort of housing futures market to have some fun there. That's good. Yeah, obviously I talked a lot to the politicians and the bureaucrats and around Wellington and all sorts of places, and sometimes get a sense of what's going to happen beforehand. Not always right. So I'm a little bit careful, and I put lots of caveats in particular the Jacinda Ardern one, which did buy me some trouble, I have to say, last year. I got a lot of pushback from Labor Green people saying, you're nuts, you know, she's doing fine. The other one was that I was sexist because, you know, somehow suggesting that she was tired and ready for a break. And you wouldn't say that about a man, would you? Yeah, I would actually say that about a man, and I wouldn't begrudge the man because both Jacinda Ardern and Grant Robertson and Chris Hipkins, actually, because really the three of them are the three people at the head of government. And that's why there isn't really that much change in policy direction, maybe at the fringes, but not really, because Chris Hipkins was one of the top three. And they've been mates, those three, since they came into Parliament in 2008. They're from the same generation. They've got the same broad views, and all of them have been working 18 hours a day for 6 years. It's one of the reasons why I think Grant Robertson decided not to go for the top job, which he would have absolutely got if he'd tried. He'd also seen the intense personal pressure that the former Prime Minister's personal, her family, her parents, and all of that sort of stuff. If you think it was, bad with people saying they wanted to kill the Prime Minister, just imagine, your auntie getting a phone call from someone saying they were going to murder the Prime Minister or something. And from what I've been told, and I haven't confirmed it, but I've heard it from a couple of sources, in October of last year, Jacinda Ardern was in a cafe in Mount Albert with her daughter, Neve. Neve, I think, is 4 at that point. She was having a fluffy, and the Prime Minister was there with some friends, having a Saturday morning coffee sort of thing that we all like to do. And someone saw through the window she was there and decided to storm in to the cafe, shouted at the Prime Minister. Now, by this stage, the diplomatic protection people were up, and this person didn't get very close to the Prime Minister, but shouted at the Prime Minister that she was going to be killed, and that she deserved to be killed, in a very disturbing stuff. And I can see why Grant Robertson didn't want the job. Chris Hipkins also has been, he's been under incredible pressure. His marriage broke up during the COVID lockdowns, and after the COVID lockdowns, sort of amazed he's still standing as well. So yeah, it's it's a tough job there, and I think it's actually one of the reasons Robertson was looking so happy on budget day. I think he can see that, you know, the finish line is not that far away.
It's interesting you say that. I certainly noticed Grant Robertson was missing in action for a good 2 or 3 weeks before the budget. You know, when there was a few crises going on, he was nowhere to be seen. Obviously focusing on budget, but not in the media, not anywhere. I've got one last
Yeah,
question for you.
He did go overseas for a couple of weeks to the IMF and the OECD spring meetings, which is what most finance ministers do. But you're right, he certainly hasn't been as present, and I wouldn't begrudge him. Most of the cabinet are absolutely shattered, as most people are, to be frank. You know, if you've been in any sort of position of authority, you know, you've got lots of employees, you've got businesses you've been trying to keep alive for the last 3 years, most people are buggered. Yeah,
it's murder in there, literally almost. Listen, I've got one last question because I asked you this the other day, and I'm interested for everyone to hear. Capital gains tax keeps rearing its head and always will. You had some thoughts on that. Just interested to share those with everyone here.
Yeah, I don't think that Labor is going to propose a capital gains tax again. The 3 times they've done it, so 2011, 14 and 17, it cost them the election. And the only reason they won in 2017 is that 4 days out from the election, Jacinda Ardern caved. She said, we won't do a capital gains tax in the first year. We'll have a tax working group. She effectively kicked it into touch then. And then, of course, as we now know, in 2019, said she'd never do it in her political lifetime. Chris Hipkins is as much of a centrist and a conservative as Jacinda Ardern. I don't think he's going to put a Labor government at risk by trying a capital gains tax. It's just too toxic. It's become like a third rail thing. You know, you touch it, you die, or at least you lose your fingers. But I think they will come at it in another way, as we've seen with the trust rate going from 33 to 39%. That there might be other quirky things they can do to target the top end. And you know, they haven't given up on the wealth tax idea, and certainly, but I don't think it's going to come in the form of a capital gains tax.
Okay, that's great to hear. Look, we'll wrap it up there today. There's so many questions we could ask you, Bernard, and we so appreciate
it. Would be
you
fun to be there.
Today.
Sorry, I can't be there. But I've enjoyed the chat sort of with the Zoom thing, and I'm glad we got there in the end. Thank you so much, and have a great weekend.
Pleasure. We'll be in touch. Thanks, Bernard.